Hello and welcome to the second episode of the North-South podcast with me, Dave Allenson, and my
Me,
lovely
Andrew
co-host.
Hardwick.
And today we're going to talk about constraints in Jiu-Jitsu, what the fuck they actually mean, what they don't mean, and how you can start applying them to your coaching and your training. Because I think something we've talked about a few times is how a lot of people think that if you're using constraints, you're immediately using ecological dynamics, and that's not the case.
No, it
But
is
go on.
not. But I would like to preface this podcast and state that although we've sort of made a little joke with the title of the podcast, being that I am from the north and Dave is from the south, we both do reside in the north, and we are currently experiencing two of the nicest days we could possibly have had all summer. For those of you who aren't orientated in the north, so I would like to preface this by saying I hope you all appreciate the fact that it is 27 degrees outside and myself and Dave are sweating our nads off inside a room.
What Andrew's trying to say is you should be thankful that he's not in his pants.
You are.
That's what he threatened me with this morning.
I'm naked from the neck under this t-shirt. There's nothing underneath.
I'll prove I am wearing shorts.
But yeah, sorry. I just wanted to make sure people understand how serious we are about this topic by the fact that we're sat inside on a very sunny day talking absolute bollocks about training.
Like a pair of fucking losers.
Yeah. But anyway, so to the topic at hand, constraints. And what does constraint mean? Now, again, a little side note we should probably make. As we have been sort of delving into this topic a little bit more, I think it's fair to say that this topic alone is probably worthy of about three or four episodes of talking about. This is probably where the meat and bones of the ecological approach, but what I consider to be the effective part. This is where the sort of the depth will come from a pragmatic training standpoint. This is where the theoretical meets the practical, in terms of session design, in terms of skill acquisition, in terms of all these different things that you want to start to implement in terms of how can we influence an individual's improvement in skill. And it is again not our goal to bamboozle you with information. What we've tried to do is we sort of reverse ordered it in terms of how we're going to approach about these. There's probably quite a clear order if you were to go away and go on Google Scholar and search skill acquisition and read a piece of literature. There's probably quite a clear order that piece of literature is written in, whereas we've decided that it's probably an easier option to give you a sort of insight from a pragmatic standpoint, and then hopefully try and introduce you into more depth of literature sort of further along the line. We're building that buy-in, for want of a better word. And obviously this is the thing where I think this is where most people are interested in this topic of skill acquisition. I think constraints is the thing that grabs people. It's the thing that makes the most sense. It's that element of where we go, right, well, I sort of know drilling isn't the most effective. I can see that. I can understand why, but what else can I do? And this is where constraint starts to get into the mix. People start to get that element of this makes sense. I like this idea. But again, this is where confusions can start to get in, and we want to make sure that we're sort of drawing some clear definitions in terms of what we mean by constraints, what it means to use constraints, and especially dependent along the lines of sort of which model you're trying to go against. And we want to make this very, very clear from the start, just because you're using constraints doesn't mean you're following an ecological approach. The constraint-led approach is something that's within an ecological framework, but that doesn't mean that just because you're using a constraint doesn't mean that you're following that method. Now, true ecologists, this is one of the reasons why we need to state this so we don't piss off half the people who might listen to this straight away. They would argue that constraint obviously is the constraint-led approach, or the CLA is the acronym, is the only way to do things. Now, me and Dave are sort of on the on the fence about things. Like we're not completely one camp or the other. We are big
Yeah.
believers in effective practice as a whole, as opposed to just simply identifying one way and that being the be all and end all. But yeah,
Yeah.
so we just wanted to sort of make that very clear from the start that you obviously, if you're somebody who's sort of relatively new to this terminology, you might be seeing various different names. People are sort of jumping on this bandwagon now, and they're using the
Yeah.
word constraint, and it's sort of getting misunderstood from a
Yeah.
contextual standpoint. It just because you are using constraints within training doesn't mean you are following an ecological approach in the truest of senses, from a purist standpoint, should we say.
Yeah. But I think it's also worth bearing in mind that for us, we're coming at this from a pragmatic perspective. Like we're both coaches. We both like you teach jiu-jitsu. I've had a lot of classroom experience. Ultimately, if it works, it works, and stuff has got to pass that test as well. And for some people, the ecological approach may not be the best in terms of they won't buy in at first, and kind of constraints are a nice little gateway drug, because if you can hook people on the idea of enjoying constraints, then the stuff later on down the line becomes less of a hard sell. And that's also, like Andrew was saying, why we've taken this kind of structure, because if you just start with all the literature, you can get very lost in that, and it doesn't mean you're actually applying it. Whereas if you start with the application, that's where you can start to see what works for you, what works for the people in front of you, what works for your context. Because it's all well and good saying you're a purist, but we can't all be, like a Greg Sauder where he can essentially come, like he's got to a point now where the room is the room that he wants, and the people who want this approach come to him. And for most of us, we're not going to be at that point. We're working in the room that we've got with the people that are in front of us, and we have to make this fit as well as we can. And if all we look in when we look in our toolbox is pure frustrating ecological approach for a group of people who've never done that before, there's a gap there that you've got to bridge before you can start to open the doors to all of that kind of stuff. So that's why we keep talking about being pragmatic. And I think it's why we also talk about, just because this stuff is sexy doesn't mean people are actually people who you would assume are knowledgeable about it aren't,
For
because
sure.
it's not the traditional model.
For sure. And something that we spoke about earlier in the week, sort of through passing conversation, and I think that this is something that is incredibly sort of overlooked because of, like you said, that sexiness, that language, that want to attach themselves to a certain ideology, is that the most important thing, in my opinion, someone may argue this differently, the single most important thing is coaching the individual.
Yeah.
And now that is the reason that why that is so important is because what we typically find, or what you'll tend to observe, is when people become so hyper fixated on one way of doing things, they lose that element of an effective tool, because they're neglecting a tool in order to fit their ideological beliefs. Now, obviously, we all have bias. We all have ways of looking at things. We all have different understandings, things that we like, things that we think will work. But fundamentally, if you're neglecting a certain element of, a certain tool that can be used to improve an individual, then I don't care how much literature you've read, you're wrong, in my opinion. I know that's quite a strict way of looking at it, but the example I'm going to give is, if you're in an ecological camp or whether you're in a traditional camp, to neglect a viewpoint of the other side because of your own personal bias is leaving cards off the table which might help another individual. And if to use that in context, sorry, Dave, I'll just finish the point.
No, go on.
If to give that context, if I'm in a class structure, so I'll use a real world example. So last night on a Monday night, we actually do a full ecological session. I've been experimenting it with from a full practice perspective. So last night we were working on front headlock control and guillotine finishes. That was one of the elements that we were looking at. Now, I set a drill, and the first 2 or 3 drills went swimmingly. Everyone was on task. They got the objective. It was brilliant. really good to see. Got to the fourth drill, I explained it, and I, again, following an ecological model, I was quite general. I didn't give them overly specific advice. I gave them thinking points to think about, and I was met with sort of blinking owls and about a million hands in the air going, "What the fuck are you going on about?" Now, if I was following if I was to be a true ecological purist, my response would be to go, right, well, I'll reframe the objective and then you just go and figure it out. Now, that might have taken me the whole lesson to get them to get to
Yeah.
that point. Now, obviously, from a understanding perspective, from a true ecological perspective, that might be the way to go about it. But me taking 5 minutes to give some descriptive information and explain things a little bit more, which probably meets along the sort of reductionist view of a traditional standpoint or a cognitive standpoint, it meant that we could get to practice much quicker, and they eventually picked up on the drill. So that's just a real world example of how we can you can still have an ecological framework, but to ignore other elements of coaching is just you're leaving cards on the table, things that could help somebody get to a position or an understanding much faster. And I've probably lost all the ecological purists who are listening to this already, because that's their viewpoint. But that's my perspective on it, and it's one of the reasons I'm in favour of the ecological model. I think it makes sense. I think the theory is fantastic, and from a practical standpoint, I think it makes a lot of sense. We'll go on to talk about a lot more about that. But I'm also of a believer of, from a strength conditioning background, is if you neglect certain areas, then you're just leaving, like I said, leaving cards on the table.
Yeah, I think that's important for a couple of reasons. Because if you're teaching people jiu-jitsu, whether you're the head coach or whatever, you're in the process of money is exchanging hands here, and you're having to provide a service. So you need to make sure that that's met, whether people like to think of it that way or not. You can't just go, well, it's their fault. I use the ecological method and they didn't get it, and next time they will. Like, you need to be a bit more flexible than that, especially because as you apply this, you will get better at doing it. I'm sure if you've been coaching, I don't know, 4 more years, 5 more years of this, you'd be able to handle that room full of what the fuck are you on about much more easily. You'd have more of an idea how to reframe it. I think sometimes people forget that when you start to apply this approach, you're going to fuck it up and you're going to make mistakes and you're going to need to win the room back, and then that'll piss you off, and for a week you're thinking, right, how do I actually do that? How would I? And that's really important as an approach for you. It's not all going to just come naturally. You can't just go, well, I'll just figure it all out like typewriters, infinite monkeys with typewriters. That's the wrong way of applying it. So in the real world, if it doesn't go right, you regroup, and maybe you fall back on something a bit more traditional for a session, and then it pisses you off and you go away and you plan better for next time. Or you spark up conversations, or you develop yourself as a coach. We've talked about this one before, to pull it straight back to teaching again. But a friend of mine, her old history teacher, just to give a bit of background, Ofsted is the organisation that inspects schools, and those little bunny ears will show you the level of respect I have for that organisation. But the inspector came in, and normally you're supposed to. They claim that you don't have to do this, but you're supposed to pull out all singing, all dancing, like phenomenal lessons that look a certain way and have a certain feel to them. And depending on what way the wind's blowing, that's either very sound, theoretically grounded educational practice, or it's bollocks. And her old history teacher did an all singing, all dancing lesson the day before. The kids hadn't got it. They'd not understood the topic at all. So the day that the Ofsted inspectors arrived, which is normally the day where you just like perform, unfortunately, the inspector came in and the kids were just doing bookwork. They were sat in silence. He was at the front of the room. Anytime they had a question, they put their hands up and asked, but they were just working through questions in a book. Now, if you ask someone if that was good teaching or not, a lot of people would tell you it wasn't. When the inspector said, why are they just doing bookwork? He was like, it's because it's what they need. Look at their books. You can see last lesson we did that. There we had some questions. They didn't know what the fuck they were on about. Like, obviously he didn't swear, but and then they followed it up with that. And it's the ballsiest thing I've ever heard of, apart from someone arguing an inspector down into changing their grade because their grade was dumb. But the importance there was he knew how to do both, and so he could use the appropriate tool when it was necessary. And he was happy to, and like fair play to him, he used it in a situation where a lot of people wouldn't. But that's the thing that we're talking about, is you've got to apply what you're using to the people that are in front of you, not sounding like you're really good at what you do because you've only got one solution.
No, 100%. And I think that, the dog's pissing me off already. I tried to bribe him with a treat before this, and it's not worked very well. I'm increasingly concerned that his head's right under the camera, and it's going to go tits up. Anyway, sorry, another Bailey distraction. I did pre-warn you in the last episode that he would appear. Anyway, so to the topic at hand, constraints. This is the thing where people get excited about. This is where most of the questions come from. Now, I think it's important to establish a bit of a background with constraint. I think constraint is something is nothing new within science. It's something that is used in a lot of things outside of psychological models. It is used in physics. It's used in evolutionary science. It's used in sort of mathematics in the context of trying to explain behavior. Now, why is this important for grappling? Well, obviously, we're trying to introduce you to the theory, so this is the theory. And the sort of more complex assessment of this is that energy, for want of a better word, energy in various different forms creates sort of patterns and information via generally the environment that creates pressure on some sort of system or model or animal, whatever it is, whatever the context of the subject that you're trying to work it in. And this constraint from the environment forces adaptation over time. So a practical way of thinking about this, and that can be sort of observed and sometimes gets referenced within the literature, is sort of how defensive situations within animals occur. So obviously, within most ecosystems, there's going to be hierarchies of a predator, of the food chain, for want of a better word. And obviously, over time, as animals evolve and develop, they develop distinct defensive strategies to try and preserve life, for want of a better word. So, for example, a really good one that was used in a piece of literature I read was sort of like schools of fish. How schools of fish sort of emerge as a large group to try and perceive themselves more threatening to predators. Obviously, a fish on its own is very small. So over time, as enough of their mates get eaten by bigger fish, they realise through constraint that, I mean, they might be having conversations about it, but obviously I'm not clued up on marine biology science, but they sort of realise that if they stay together as a group, their chances of being eaten by a larger animal are much less significant. And this is how we can start to see how constraints from an environmental perspective can shape behaviour. Now, in the context of grappling, this doesn't hold very much information. What I'm trying to get at from a point is that we as coaches need to understand that utilising constraint has the potential to change our perception and our action. Whether you can look at that as sort of two different things, but essentially they act as one. The constraint has the ability to impact our affordances for action based on that perception and that action. So that can change how we view or our intent around a task. Have I done a good job of explaining that, or is that just I've just talked absolute bollocks for a few minutes?
I think, but so essentially, a constraint's more like a guiding hand. Yeah, rather than like holding. If you think of the traditional approach, probably unfairly, as holding someone by the scruff of the neck and going, "This is fucking what you need to do." The guiding hand is kind of, oh, maybe in this direction. Go and explore and see. And you've cleverly set it up so you know that there's only a few options that they're gonna like correct and incorrect options that they're going to have to like muddle their way through. In the same way that the selection pressure of being eaten means that over time, really complicated solutions to it's the same as our bodies. Like
Yeah.
we've evolved over a very, very long time to have this ridiculous level of systems and like the microbiome. No one realized before we sound like a couple of I get up at 4:30 in the morning and here's the gut microbiome's linked to depression, all that shite. But the reason people are so shocked by it is because there seems to be this whole other internal world of things that we didn't realize infects each other, because it's just such another level of complexity on top of what's already a complex system. So it's realizing that things that can be quite simply understood in terms of the constraints are quite, once you work them out, can be quite, seem almost like, oh, is that it? Like getting eaten and not being able to reproduce, that's not much. But in that, the level of variation that results is huge. Like you'd never be able to study all of it if you tried.
For sure. And I think a really, really important point to make is when we're talking about constraint in, I mean, you could look at it from a general worldwide perspective, but obviously we're primarily focused on the implications of how we can use constraint from skill. Constraint works as a function by removing variability. I think that's a really important distinction to make.
Yeah.
And often where confusion gets made. Now, when we're now, again, the point we made at the start in terms of like the difference between using constraint and using a constraint-led approach is they sort of function on the same spectrum, but the objective behind each area changes. And I think this is where people fail to understand constraint, because when we implement constraint, we're trying to compress the variability. So most constraints are going to operate in this like sort of spectrum of compression and expansion of variability depending on the task related goal. And that's obviously where the constraint is. And if you're somebody who is like listening to this and you're like, right, my first and foremost is what does constraint mean? Constraint is always about how are we removing a certain element of the task.
Yeah.
It's we have to look at it. Obviously, we want to look at it from the perspective of, right, well, what's the end objective that we're trying to work towards? But by working towards that, what are we removing away? How are we changing the environment, and how does changing the environment influence us as an individual and the task that we're trying to complete by taking away certain elements of variability in order to shape sort of behavior? And
yeah,
like Dave said, the idea behind this is we're trying to find we're trying to put a drill or a game or whatever you want to use, the terminology you want to use, to try and allow an individual to discover a stable solution or a efficient solution to a problem without us as individuals going, that's the problem. This is what you need to do in order to solve that problem. And obviously, we're doing this. Sorry, Dave. No, go on.
No. Well, just an example of it is like with the buggy choke. That constraint was that was someone allegedly. I don't know how true all of the rumors are. That originally it was some like white or blue belt went to their instructor, and then it developed, and then guys ran with it. But that's an example of a constraint where someone's playing in bottom side control a lot, and figures something out that other people hadn't really realized. They were just applying the same principles and going, oh yeah, there's something here. And it turns out that isn't just some flash in the pan bullshit move that is unstable and works for a few people in a certain environment. It actually is effective. You might not personally want to include it in your game, but you can't deny that people at the very top have had great success applying it to other people at the top who know that they're going to do it. And that's kind of a sign of a stable solution, is one that can withstand that sort of testing, rather than it just being that one person who does it and actually it doesn't always work for them.
Yeah, for sure. And I think once you sort of, again, like we said, this is quite a long topic. The expansion of constraint from a obviously theoretical standpoint into a practical standpoint, it's an endless discussion, because as we said in episode 1 is we don't really know. We don't know.
Yeah.
We have the bare bones in terms of how can we look at the key elements of various different approaches, but the actual fundamental answer is very limited. But from a theoretical understanding, what we can look at constraint and we can start to see sort of pictures of how constraint can influence practicality or skill. And we can look at this from a very general perspective, or we can look at this from a very sort of specific perspective. Now, obviously, when you're looking at it from the framework of an ecological approach, you've got environmental constraints, you've got individual constraints, and you've got task constraints. And those three things interact and shape behavior. But from a general perspective, we can see this across all of combat sports. You can see it in sports in general. But if we look at combat sports and specifically the grappling sports, so obviously we look at wrestling, we look at judo, we look at Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, we can start to see how task constraints, i.e. the rule sets of those individual sports, influence how behavior emerges in those sports, and how we can start to see that representation of efficient movement solutions. Now, obviously, this holds no value in terms of practical implementation, but it gives us a broad picture of what a constraint is. Judo players are notoriously effective at arm bars, notoriously effective at, obviously, throws. But wrestlers, extremely effective at putting someone on their back and holding them on someone on the back. Jiu-Jitsu players, very good off their backs, because their rules constrain an individual's interaction with the task that they're trying to complete. And through that pattern, we start to see how different behaviors emerge. Now, if you've spent any time around grappling, which presumably anyone who's listening to this has, they all operate within the same sort of governing laws. The sport doesn't really change how we interact as individuals. We're all human beings. We all function in very specific ways. But the slight change in rules dictates how we interact with that task goal and how we move and how we stabilize an efficient solution to problems based on that task-orientated goal. And that has come as a byproduct of the constraint from the rule set, not just because it's an easy way to do it. If you remove... Judo's a good example because they removed... you couldn't grab the legs anymore. So it changed how an individual had to interact with a throw. I remember listening to Owen Livesey talk about how he, obviously, for those who don't know, Owen Livesey has got a world-class fireman's carry. He had to adapt his entry from a fireman's carry because he then could no longer grab the legs. So the constraint of the rule set has influenced his solution to using a skill to formulate a task-related outcome.
I think you see the same thing as well with judo, that famously, like a few years ago at one of the Olympics, was it freestyle wrestling was removed, or was it folk style? One of them anyway.
Can't remember.
It got replaced by skateboarding, and basically that was a signal to all of the it was a signal to all of the traditional sports that have been involved since the Olympics were restarted in the 20th century. That was like, you've got to watch out. You are, if you're not deemed watchable, you're gone. And for a lot of the judo's solution was to, if I'm remembering it right, was to really focus on the big throws and like the ippons. And so as a result, newaza, or the groundwork, was, to sound like John Danaher for a second, was essentially you've got so little time to work on the floor and you have to be moving, or you're just going to get stood up. Then groundwork kind of becomes a waste of time in terms of the reward that it gives you. It needs to be quick. It needs to be like an armbar that you can grab onto as they land, or it's become even more accentuated than it was before, where if you take guys who learn judo in the 70s and 80s, they've got a lot more ground understanding because you were allowed longer on the ground before the ref would stand you up. So just to follow that on.
No, but and that obviously that doesn't hold much value from a practical standpoint. It's just a really good way of starting to see how constraints interact with sport, how the constraints of the sport or the task influence our behavior as an individual and also influence the sort of affordances that we perceive from the environment, i.e., our opponent.
Yeah.
So to sort of go back to what we were trying to make from a point perspective, when it comes to a practical application, the overall theme of utilizing the constraint, whether you're using a true sort of ecological constraint-led approach system, or you're just simply trying to introduce constraints from a training perspective, is, as I said, we're not trying to tell the person the most efficient way of doing things. We're trying to constrain a certain area, usually the environment or the task, in order for an individual to come up with the sort of solution themselves. And to give an example of this is, let's say we use the back. Let's say we're working from the back. Now, obviously, this is going to be a pretty rough example because it's off the top of my head. But let's say, for example, the constraint we're utilizing is you start in the back, you've got both hooks in, you're working for a seatbelt grip. Your objective from an attacker is simply to, I mean, you could go as specific as you wanted. You could go, I simply want you to take double wrist control, for example.
Yeah.
Now, let's go a bit deeper. Let's say the aim of the game is to secure a rear naked choke or a rear strangle of some degree. Now, what we've actually done is we're looking at that and we're going, right, well, that we've identified a problem that somebody's going to have. They're going to have to win the grip battle. They have to get their hand under the chin, and then they have to secure the choke. So we've got three very, very specific problems that an individual has to solve and deal with. Now, we've not given them any instruction of how to do that. We might give them some certain tips or objectives, to sort of work towards, but we've not actually really told them how to do it. It's just things to think about. What we've constrained is the fact that there's no other transition. So there's no transition into mount if someone sits the hip. There's no attack in the arms. And obviously with that, we lose an element of representativeness, which we talked about last week. But what we're trying to do is limit the amount of information they have to process in order to get to a specific goal. And that's sort of how the constraints work. And again, this is a spectrum of application. You can go really hyper-specific in terms of like a reductionist view that we talked about last week, in terms of you could start with the grip fight. Like, how can we just, first and foremost, get cross-body wrist control, as an example, and then you can layer that up to increase the variability that they have to work towards. Obviously, the more things that they have to think about, the higher the variability, the more problem solving and the more complex, quote unquote complex, the task becomes. And now this is something that, from an ecological perspective, is something called constrain to afford. So we're using a constraint in order for an individual to build up a perspective of affordance within the tasks that they're trying to complete. If that makes sense.
Okay. Yeah. So I think it helps to kind of bring it back to a little bit of common sense as well, in that there'll be some people sitting here thinking, well, it just sounds like a really fancy way of saying, if you limit stuff, that's going to affect the outcome. And that's essentially the point that we're making. So like the one I always think of is, if you've got a gym where everyone starts from the knees, then you're going to get a group of people who are pretty good at passing from the knees, but probably wank at passing from standing, and pretty good at defending passes from the knees, but not great at defending passes from standing. And you can't just sort of just chuck in some constraints in and hoping probably isn't enough. But equally, it's not necessarily a case of, I think sometimes some people think, oh, you've got to break it down into the sub skills and then slowly build back out. And the point is, if you're playing with constraints, is you can use them in different ways. So like the one I always think of is, I used to coach rugby, and one of the things that the RFU would really push was whole part whole. So you'd purposely put people in a full scale game, knowing maybe you'd introduce some constraints to focus on a specific thing you knew they fucked up the week before in the match. And when it all went wrong, you'd be like, well, why did that go wrong? They go, oh, you'd have a bit of little short discussion about it. And then you'd have put together some drills or smaller sided games that would try and build the skills. And then you'd go back to a whole session towards the end to try and implement it. Again, you might do that across a few sessions, but I think sometimes it helps to realize it's not just a linear path. That's not how learning works. For some people, whole part whole will be great. For others, they'll be sat in the first bit going, what the fuck's going on? Or they'll get loads out of the middle section and then nothing out of the end because they're not good enough to get to the position that you practiced.
Yeah, for sure. And I think this is the problem we're sort of seeing at the moment from like a media standpoint, where people are losing maybe a bit of interest in the constraints-led approach or an ecological approach. Because I saw a video the other day of a sort of really successful UK black belt, and he was talking about like he was talking about the drilling versus not drilling argument, and he was sort of saying that obviously when you're a beginner, you don't know anything, and that's why drilling is important. And on one hand, I'd agree, because obviously the individuals need contextual understanding. But on the other hand, I'd also disagree, because as a beginner, you have no bias. You have no contextual understanding. Your understanding might be, I've seen someone do an armbar in the UFC. So we can use that and we can implement that through constraint. If you were like, this is something I think that Greg Saunders does really well when he's explaining things, is his approach from beginners, is we can break down the sort of fundamentals, quote unquote fundamentals of the sport, and provide someone with a load of hands-on practical experience. Without actually showing them anything. Now, I'm not saying this is the most effective. I'm just saying this is a different way of looking at that argument. I something that I've talked about to you in the past as well is it always makes me laugh when I see black belts and they'll go, we're running a beginner's course and everyone's doing really well. It's good to see them doing the things that we've shown. And in my head, I think, well, of course they're doing the things you've shown, because they don't know how to do anything else. So, in a way, when we think about constraint, we've already constrained individuals from the off, because we are limiting what they know from. Excuse me, there's someone at the door, but they can get fucked. We're already limiting their understanding from a constraint perspective. Because we're narrowing them down. Like we're already constraining their behaviour through teaching them an armbar from guard, which we know is wank, and very few people, unless you're Hodger Gracie, are very good at it. But we've already, like, when we look at it from that perspective, those initial stages, I know we're getting a bit on a tangent here and talking about something completely different, but it applies to the constraint model when you think about it from a theoretical standpoint, because that information that we're giving them relatable to the task, we're already constraining them because they don't know how to do anything else. So we're giving them one objective, as opposed to probably maybe looking at it from a more general perspective and looking at it in terms of them just actually being in the environment and interacting with the things that are around them from a really simplistic point of view, in terms of, like, you could look at pinning, for example, and use side control, I don't know, whatever you want to use, and just have them in that environment interacting, and then from there start to specify little bits of information. Would that have a greater benefit from an overall influence perspective than going, right, you're a beginner, this is an armbar from guard? Now, I'm not saying that's not the right way to do it. I'm just simply trying to give a different perspective of looking at it, because as soon as we go, we have to understand the constraints. I'll go off on a podcast here, a tangent here, but I was listening to. I'm interested in dog training. One of my interests is listening to dog training. I've got a dog, and I like giving him the best life he possibly can have. So I was listening to a podcast the other day, and they were talking about sort of the personality of dogs, and they were talking about how is their personality a genetic trait, or is it influenced by their training? Or, in the context of an ecological approach, the environment that we create and the tasks that we give them as an animal. And it was really interesting to listen to these, like, expert dog trainers talk about that, and it made me start thinking about it in the context of humans. And that initial stage, that beginner stage, is exactly the same.
Yeah.
Because every interaction you have with your dog, say between 0 and 3 years, and arguably ongoing, is going to
Yeah.
influence how that dog turns out.
Yeah.
It's going to influence their aggressiveness. Every interaction they have as a puppy and onwards influences their personality.
Yeah.
Now, obviously, there are certain genetic things that can influence it. But when we look at it from a human perspective, obviously humans and dogs are slightly different. But the overall theme was the point that I was trying to make was
Yeah.
every time we put a task in place, in theory, we're constraining that individual. And that's impacting how they perceive information within a context of an environment. And that, in theory, should then influence how they develop, how they learn, how they perceive, how they interact, and how they organize from a skill perspective or a movement perspective. Sorry, that was a tangent.
No. But it's just made me think of something that I think highlights the kind of guiding principle. It's like the opposite of like a helicopter parent, where it's like, you will do this, you will do that. How well are you doing in this? What are you doing today? Like, there was a chess champion. I'm going to butcher the story here, but he had two daughters, and he wanted to produce. It was in Eastern Europe, and he wanted to produce two of the best. Well, he just wanted to produce champions, essentially. And the traditional method was like, you'd send them off somewhere. It was very strict. There'd be all these like strict ways of doing it. And he was talking about how he got his daughters interested, because lots of other grandmasters had tried, and their kids just railed against it or didn't give a shit. And what he said he did was he played chess around them. He left the chessboards in there. He had like interesting conversations and made it exciting when they asked questions about the chessboard and kind of what it was. And he normalized it around them so that eventually the constraints were, he was into chess and the chessboard was there, and he was happy to talk to them about it and bring it to their, I like the shape of that piece, and he'd have a discussion with them about it. And that way they led themselves towards it and were interested and internally motivated, rather than, and he was trying to make a point that you could do that without pressuring people into the approach. I'll have to go and find his name, but it's that same kind of thing of using constraints to guide people towards solutions. In his case, the solution was wanting to learn chess, which then opens up a whole other avenue of the same process. But you can't, I suppose the other point is, you can't force people into constraints. You can in that you can design the practice to be a certain way, but if someone's going to rail against it, they're going to rail against it. You kind of got to kind of trick them into it a little bit without them necessarily realizing. And constraints can be a really nice way of doing that, because for most people, they'll recognize positional sparring. That's like, that's we talked about it last week, didn't we? Last podcast, that people sometimes disparage this approach by going, "Oh, that's just positional sparring. We do that." And I think it's worth talking about what sits behind it. Why positional sparring? All positional sparring is a form of constraint, but not all constraints have to be positional sparring. And in the same way that like all positional could be used to further emergent learning, it doesn't mean that's what you're doing if you use them.
Yeah, and I agree. And I think just to backtrack a tiny little bit, because obviously we've gone off on a bit of a general tangent about constraint. When we're looking at it from a sort of behavioural standpoint, so when we're looking at it from a skill standpoint, if we're taking a ecological approach, we've got obviously the triad of interaction. We've got the environment, we've got the individual, and we've got the task. And the constraints of all those three different things are going to influence us all as individuals from a unique standpoint, how we process information, what we perceive as an action, and how we organize that into a stable solution. And to give an example of this was, I was in the gym. I was just sat on a bench, sort of minding my own business, and I was listening to a group of lads in the gym talking about training, and these are all good level grapplers. I think they were brown and a black belt, and I was sort of just earwigging, not minding my own business, not minding my own business. That's the complete opposite to earwigging. And one of the lads said, and this is a quote, and he said, "Isn't it funny how we've all been taught the same things, but we all do different things on the mat?" And I thought, this is my chance to intervene, and I was like, so I shouted his name, and I was like, based on that comment you've just said, does that not make you think that how we've been taught jiu-jitsu is wrong? And obviously that's a bit of a loaded question. It's a deep question. But when you think about it from that perspective, that question itself starts to make the constraints-led approach or the theoretical application of constraint make a little bit more logical sense. Because if you think about it, we all have been taught the same things. We all know that a knee cut is a knee cut. We all know that this sweep works, that sweep works. But yet we all organise ourselves in very different ways to fit our perception of action. This is why we have different games. If constraints didn't exist, we'd all do exactly the same thing.
Yeah.
Because how we organise ourselves is based on us as an individual, our own constraints. Are we, like we talked about last week, are we tall? Are we short? Are we strong? Are we weak? Are we mobile? Are we stiff? Do we have injuries? Are we 50 or are we 16? Like, that's what we consider sort of individual constraints. And then how we as an individual interact with our environment, i.e. the individual we're grappling with, are they long? Are they short? Are they hairy? Are they smooth, like we talked about last week? Are they old? Are they young? Are they fast? Are they slow? And then obviously you've got is the ground slippy? Is it dry? Is it cold outside? Is it warm in the room?
Yeah.
Whatever it is it loud, quiet? And then that obviously affects our perception for action. And then obviously from there, you've got the task that we're trying to complete. If we're on the bottom position and I'm trying to put the top player on his ass, how is my physical presence and my constraint as an individual going to allow me to then take in the information of the environment? How are they moving? And how is that going to influence my perception or my affordance to put top player on his backside? Which is how we then come to, as individuals, organise ourselves into solutions, i.e. in jiu-jitsu we call it like a game, or you've got a specific technique that we all focus towards. Now, obviously, we know that there are efficient ways of doing things, which is why there are different variations. It's why there's a spider guard. It's why there's a half guard. It's why there's a butterfly guard. Because there are many different various efficient solutions, but our constraints as an individual, how we perceive that information from the environment and relate it to the task at hand, affects how we learn and we apply and we stabilize ourselves from a movement perspective. And this is where constraints fit into the mix. And this is where the constraint-led approach that comes from ecological dynamics gets its theoretical framework, because we're taking that theory and trying to create a practice environment which, for want of a better word, sort of artificially recreates that interaction with a task or an individual.
Yeah. So
Sorry,
you just sparked something off him.
To clarify.
No, it's good. It's good. You sparked something off in my head there that I think sometimes you can see why. And we talked about this in the last podcast. That's my catchphrase today. But you can see that when high-level people don't perform at the level that you think they would. And sometimes that's just because the constraints of the environment are different. So, for example, competing at a high level at like invitationals and sub-onlys and stuff that are kind of more like Empire, or it's a room where there's a lot of other competitions going on and other people are competing around you, and then you've got a central mat. That's very different to, say, a Grapple Fest or a Polaris, where it is everyone in the fucking room, it's dark, lights are on you, and everyone is watching you and no one else. Like, you may find that's a difficult bridge to cross as a grappler until you've experienced it a few times, because it's just a different set of constraints. Or the... Fuck, I've forgotten it now. You sparked something else off in my head as well. never mind. It'll come to me later, and I'll interrupt you.
So I've got another really good practical example of how this might make more sense to an individual. Is because we're in a contact sport, presumably everybody has been injured at some point or another. Now, maybe you've been injured to the point where it's not severe enough that you need to take a bit of time off, but it's sort of severe enough that you're limited from what you can do from a movement perspective. Now, that injury is what we'd consider an individual constraint. And next time hopefully you don't get hurt, but presumably you will be hurt at some point. Next time you pick up an injury which limits your capability from a movement standpoint, watch how it influences the decisions you make on the mats from a movement perspective. And watch how that then therefore influences your interaction with a task and how you then problem solve to meet the requirements of the task that you're trying to complete. Another good example is if you're a person who likes to cross train, go and train at a gym where maybe you don't train with people regularly and watch how somebody moving in a different way influences your interaction with a task. And we can start to see how the perspective of constraint influences your behaviour. For example, have got to use myself as an example, I've got a bit of a tweaked knee at the minute. Now, it's not bad enough to stop me from training. It's just bad enough where I have to just be careful about where I'm putting my legs. And I went and trained at an open mat on the bank holiday last. And normally I'm quite a sort of, still I'm a bit of a bendy guard pulling knobhead, but like it completely changed how I had to problem solve because my usual tricks and techniques, or what I would consider my quote unquote A game, which is the terminology that gets used, I couldn't play that game because I couldn't elevate with my right leg. So I had to essentially change the way that I went about solving the problem. It changed my affordance. It changed the tasks that I was trying to work towards. So instead of maybe, to give an example, maybe instead of trying to leg lock somebody, because I can't use my elevator, it becomes, right, how can I get somebody's back? And that constraint influenced how I interacted with the environment. And then you add random people into the mix as well that I'm not used to training with, who maybe I've got that stranger danger. I'm a bit nervous about, I have got an injury, so I'm like, are they going to be a knobhead and spaz out all over the place and cause me more harm? It's constraining my decision making straight away.
Yeah.
Obviously, it's a very general perspective, but if you're an individual listening to this and you're like, well, I'm still not sure how that makes sense, think about it from that standpoint. Next time you've got a bit of tendinitis and you can't grip properly, just from an external perspective, just think about how that's influencing your behaviour. And sometimes that awareness is just enough to go, oh shit, that makes sense now. I'm starting to see how this can fit into that perspective.
Yeah. Or it kind of makes what's Cam's surname from ASW? Because I'm going to say it wrong.
Atakaru.
It is Atakaru, right? So I got in my head that it was Atakuru. Anyway, it doesn't matter. One of the things that he says in it's either the front headlock DVD or the one that he did on takedowns for jiu-jitsu, is the takedowns for jiu-jitsu one. He talks about the wrestler stance and why you stand in it. And he was like, for some people, this will be enough that they just won't really like grapple with you properly because they'll look at you and go, shit, they know what they're doing. And as silly as that sounds, giving someone the impression it forces that it can, depending on their personality, force them into a constraint. So if you think the other person's shit hot on the feet, well, you're going to pull guard. If you think that they're better than you, in the same way you probably won't wrestle up because you don't think it's worth it. Or Kit Dale's point of like making it look like he didn't know what he was doing in certain situations when he knew exactly what he was going to do, because then that person goes, oh, fucking idiot, I'll just take a risk. And then they shouldn't. Or making it look like you do know what you're doing when actually you haven't got a fucking clue what's going on. It's constraints exist and are useful for coaches, but they're also a helpful way of thinking about why certain things happen within the sport. And realistically, it's why the sport is exciting and why sport full stop is exciting, because things can happen that if it were all technical and on paper and constraints didn't limit actions and influence them in that way, it wouldn't be very interesting to watch, because you'd just be like, oh, like jiu-jitsu maths never quite works, because what one guy can do to someone might not necessarily be the same as what someone they've lost to could do, and that sort of thing.
No, for sure. And I think before, obviously, we will move on to a more
We'll get
specific
back to
topic.
it.
I think a good way of summarising in this is to think about it in this context. Any constraint, and based on what you've just said, any constraint relative to an individual, to an environment, or to the task has the potential to change how we perceive information.
Yeah.
And that change in how we take in information is going to change our behaviour. Like you said, it could
So
be
like
something as...
like, I'm just thinking first ever competition for a white or blue belt, and you have that horrible moment of like, fuck, I've forgotten all my jiu-jitsu. And it's
Yeah,
because for whatever reason, the probably the environment is and how your opponent has acted, and they've seemed more confident than you, it's thrown you. And so
yeah.
your brain is catching up with that, and the constraint is you can't remember what you're supposed to do. And I remember like resurfacing like a minute and a half later, like, oh, it's half guard. Okay, yeah, I know what's happening now.
Yeah. And it's in like, yeah, and to use your example you just used, you slap hands with a guy and he instantly just drops into a wrestler stance, and your brain just goes, "Oh fucking hell, what's going to happen here? I don't
Oh,
want anything to
fuck's
do with
sake.
that." Like, and I'm not saying like you could have Jordan Burroughs level double legs. You probably don't, but like let's pretend that you do. You could
I do not.
yeah, me neither. That change in information has just
Yeah.
completely altered your perspective and your interaction with that task. And your focus
Yeah.
instantly shifts from, right, well, that's gone out the window. I now need to find a safer route to doing it. And although it's a very simplistic way of looking at it, that's essentially the point that we're trying to make from how constraint, whether it's an individual factor, whether it's an environmental, or whether it's a task-related factor, usually they do all interact as one, but one element can change the other two as well. And that's how we can
Yeah.
start to see this picture of constraint. That was
Well,
a big fucking rabbit hole.
Yeah, but just to stay in the rabbit hole for a second, that's a point that Craig Jones is very good at making, is the constraint of the task that's in front of you, as in the rule set, can completely change your approach. So for him, he wants something where it's quick, whereas he was saying for Gordon wants a nice long match because he knows that he can drag you into deep waters and do what he wants to do. Craig wants it to be like that because then there's silly decisions made by people. There's like, I mean, he keeps joking about how he's got no gas tank, but it's why people who succeed in one format, because we have no fucking central unifying rules, might struggle in another. You know, you take the IBJJF guy and put him in sub only, it's going to be a bit of a learning curve to begin with, in the same way that arguably, although I suppose Gordon kind of disproved this, but the argument for a lot of the IBJJF guys was, oh well, come to the IBJJF, you won't be able to do that. And I imagine his training changed considerably to take those constraints into account so that he could play a points game and not just a sub only.
Yeah, and that leads us quite nicely into this, like obviously you mentioned before we went on the tangent of the specific sparring versus a constraint-led approach. And as you said, all specific sparring is a constraint, but not all constraints are... Have I got that the right way around?
You can constrain in ways that aren't specific sparring.
Yeah, that's it. That's what I was trying to say. And we can start to see... Once we understand that sort of theoretical standpoint from a constraint, we can start to understand how we can influence behaviour. And the fundamental idea behind a constraint-led approach compared to a specific sparring approach is the constraint-led approach is individual-focused. It should be. Anyway, I'm not saying everyone is, but it should be individual-focused. It is that idea of design in practice that, again, expands and constricts variability in order to lead an individual to be a effective problem solver. It is we're trying to provide them with the ability to have good contextual understanding of a relative position, and I'm going to have to refer to my notes for this because I wrote a quote, but I can't remember off the top of my head. But also the ability to formulate stable but adaptable solutions in the presence of variability. That's the idea behind the constraint-led approach. It's not necessarily right or wrong. It's what's effective at that moment in time based on the information available to the individual.
Yeah.
Whereas a specific sparring approach, although it is an element of constraint, generally speaking, now there will be people who implement specific sparring extremely effectively, but
Yeah.
generally, specific sparring it's either too vague or it's too specific, meaning that
Yeah.
it's generally quite rigid and it's generally class focused, not individual focused. So to
Yeah.
use this in an example of terminology that we used in the last podcast, when we talked about like the traditional approach will be that layering of, you start at a really simple task. So you start with the grip and you drill the grip, and then you drill the grip and the posture break, and then you drill the grip and the posture break and the momentum shift. So you shift the weight and then you drill the sweep, and then you go, right, we're going to go in specific sparring and we're going to work this with the hope that all those things come together and it emerges from that environment. And there is value to specific sparring. There is value to like just start in mount and try and get a submission. That is an element of constraint, and that can be really effective. But from a individual standpoint, if we're looking at it from the goal of the individual, our aim with the constraint is to guide the individual to make more effective decisions relative to a specific technique, to give them the ability to problem solve under variability, as opposed to just going, we drilled this, let's work from mount, go and fucking figure it out.
Yeah. So would correct me if I'm wrong, but would a better example be where you might start them in that position, but you don't give any specific solutions? It might be just find a submission or a sweep or a mount escape. And like, I know I've started some rounds. We've had some conversations about this where I'm trying to get the most out of training once a week, but twice a week at the moment. But I start from being mounted and just try and find a variety of different escapes. And realistically, I end up coming back to one, which is half guard. But the fact that I've tried others and had, it will be with different training partners and they'll apply mount in different ways, it allows me to get a load of practice in without the practice literally just being, oh, I'll push you and you will fall and go this way. Like it's repetition without repetition. And the constraint is as open as,
Yeah, that's it. And again, but this is where it's interesting, because what you've done is influence some degree of constraint to yourself. But what you're not using is a constraint-led approach, because you're not.
Yeah.
Now, this is where it gets confusing, because somebody asked us this question on Instagram that we'll probably try and touch on later, and I'm not sure we're going to do a good enough job of explaining it. But this is where the confusion lies, because you've used a constraint and you've done the right thing. You're putting yourself in bad positions. You're making things hard for yourself. Again, you're not repeating a solution. You're trying to repeat a problem to build up a contextual understanding of that problem so you can problem solve under higher variability. But the difference is, with a constraint-led approach, it's more focused. You could argue it's more reductionist. It can often seem very task specific, but it's actually, the underpinnings aren't task specific. They are based on the governing laws of grappling. That's the idea behind the constraint-led approach. What you're trying to do is provide or improve somebody's movement based on the underpinnings of a successful technique, not the technique itself. And I know that might sound confusing. The example I'll give is, so we'll use the leg lock. The leg lock's the really simple one to do. So you could put a constraint-based drilling or a game in place. So the one we used one recently that I really liked and was quite effective. So both individuals start seated. Both have got 1 foot in, 1 foot out, and essentially it's a free-for-all. Now, they can both attack and they both can defend. The only task objective is either to submit somebody or defend and stay in the pocket. And by the pocket, I mean you just can't run away. You've got to stay in that the entanglement of legs and continue to look to fight. So the what that would seem from an external perspective is that I'm trying to get guys really good at entering into leg lock entanglements. Now there is an element of that because that's the task. The actual thing that we're trying to get good at is winning the inside. So your success is going to be determined by winning that inside position. Because if you don't win the inside, you're never going to get to an entanglement to actually attack anyway. So when we put constraints in place, that's what I mean by they perceive to be task specific, but they're actually specific to an underlying sort of principle or law or fundamental of the game. And by getting really good at that, that should, in theory, lead us to more success in a specific task.
Yeah.
So we can start to see how the constraint-led approach slightly differs from a simple constraint or a specific sparring. Now, this is where it gets confusing because it is very highly perceptive. Like, you have to be on the ball with watching it, and if you fuck it up, they'll just do something else completely different. And there's, again, one of the most interesting thing about constraints is when we implement a drill or a game, again, general terminology, is we actually don't know how an individual's going to interact with that game. And there was a really interesting piece of literature that I found about they were looking at like constraining field hockey players. So what they did was they were trying to see how a constraint on a field hockey pitch influenced the outcome. And so what they did was they took, instead of playing with 11 people on a full pitch, they played with 8. Now, what they found was, from an attacking perspective, the things that you'd expect to happen happened. So there was higher pass success rate. There was a great, I can't remember the list. I need to find the list somewhere. It's in my notes.
The game is more open.
Yeah, the game was more. I can't remember where I found it. I've lost my perspective. Where is it? I have got the good notes here somewhere, people. I promise. We do make notes. We are prepared for this. I would like you to have. We don't guess.
Andrew's even printed them out.
I have printed them out. Look, I'll even show you on camera. So what they found was that there was a greater number of passes completed, a reduced number of unsuccessful passes, a higher number of dribbles completed. Now, this makes sense. This is quite a logical outcome. There'd be more space on the pitch. You'd expect there'd be more room to run into, and there'd be less overall, I guess, influence from a past successful completion. So we can start to see how constraints affect an attacking perspective. But the interesting thing that happened was, by reducing the number of players on the pitch, it actually led to an increase in pressure situations because of the defensive team had more ground to cover. So what happened was they man-marked their individuals more. So the attacking players were under more pressure, which is actually, in theory, you would think would happen less. More space, you think, would increase more time. But we can start to see how the drills we implement from a jiu-jitsu standpoint, obviously there's going to be certain things that we want to happen from that drill in terms of how that individual ends up completing a task. But we can start to see how it doesn't always influence things in a way that we'd expect them to influence. And this was a really good piece of literature from that perspective, because it demonstrates how constraints can give us certain solutions that we want, but it can also influence other areas. Like the hockey players, the higher pressure changed, the open space changed the defensive strategy. And it's just important to recognise, obviously it has no practical application from a grappling perspective, but it's useful to think about, because when we're building drills or you're trying to use an ecological approach or a constraint-led approach, we have to recognise both sides of the coin, because there's always going to be an attacker and a defender within a combat situation, or most sporting situations are going to be an attacker and a defender. But even more so with jiu-jitsu and grappling, because our constraint is going to not only affect how we perceive information as an attacker, but also how the defensive player perceives information and their affordance from a defensive perspective.
Yeah. So to bring it back to an example, let's see if I've pulled one out of my arse here, and you can tell me whether this is appropriate or not. But if you were to, for example, start people in side control and tell one person that they need to submit and the other person that they need to essentially stand up and escape, or get a knee back in, or whatever escape you want to let them practice. And actually, what you're really looking for is them to understand the principles of pinning. You can tell
Sorry,
me if
say
I'm
that.
completely wrong.
Say that
Yeah, yeah.
again.
So it was that actually the purpose of the drill is to encourage them to discover what the principles of pinning are. Because for the
Okay.
defender, they need to understand what pinning is so that they can,
Yeah.
or they will start to expose what pinning is or isn't about that inside battle and controlling that space. And
Yeah.
for the person attacking, they're going to have to figure that out. Otherwise, they're never going to get a sub.
Yeah, for sure. And this is where jiu-jitsu is interesting because we've always got two sides of the coin. So what we influence from an attacking standpoint will influence the decisions of the defender, as we've just mentioned. So in the context of pinning, what we can do is we can actually have an element of understanding from both parties, to use the context of pinning again, because the defensive player will just do the opposite of what the attacking player would do.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
Now, how again? This is where it gets confusing because we're going down. Obviously, again, for those that are listening, we will touch on. We're going to have to touch on constraints more because it's a very open-ended topic in terms of application. There's so much to unpack from a practicality standpoint in terms of session design. The decision-making process is quite intricate. From a coaching perspective, now it can seem quite general, but you'll have to make certain decisions in terms of like what's going to be impactful. But again, if let's say, for example, like you said, we've got a defensive player and attacking player, and the defensive player is looking to hold side control, like you said. Sorry, attacking players looking to hold side control. Defensive player, like you said, could be a re-guard or it could be just something as simple as create space. Both like really good effective drills, really good constraints. Again, if we use a guard, that's going to change the affordance of the attacking player because it's going to change the behaviour of the defending player.
Yeah.
But let's say we're giving the attacking player objectives. Let's say we're saying, right, what we want to think about is creating wedges either side of the body, creating some degree of control from a rotational standpoint, whether it be elbows, whether it be head, whether it be shoulders, whatever sort of terminology you want to use, whatever information we need to try and underlay onto that individual. We're obviously going to get the opposite strategy from a defensive player, which is where this ecological approach comes in because it starts to build that level of representativeness. Obviously, we've got a level, we're losing a level of representativeness because the defender know what's coming, but it then influences the problems that we have to interact with. So if let's say you're watching your class or you're within the class and you're trying to think, right, how can I apply a little bit of this logic to myself or to my students? You're watching them and you're finding guys that are really good at getting to turtle. So maybe you're a bit more a wrestling heavy gym. Guys are really good at getting to turtle and creating separation. So from a defensive standpoint, we might limit the defender. We might say, right, you can't get to turtle. You've got a guard. You've got to get to your guard. Or you might put a time frame on it. You might say you can get to turtle, but you can only spend 2 seconds there, 3 seconds there. And that, again, is going to influence the decisions. Now, the problem we have from a constraints perspective is, and this was something I was having a chat with one of the lads at our gym last night about, is because we lose that level of representativeness, it actually influences the game. And this is where it becomes quite challenging. Because as you said, from a defensive standpoint, turtle and guard are both extremely valid options. Turtle creates more affordances from a back control perspective, but guard creates more affordances from a pinning perspective because we can flatten them out. But what we have to try and draw a line with from a coaching standpoint is what is the underlying thing that we're trying to guide them towards. It's having that understanding that losing an element of representativeness will come at the cost of that realistic element, but hopefully should help guide towards the task that we're trying to work towards. So last night when we were working front headlock and guillotines, one of the lads, as we were working like the final drill of looking for a finish, and one of the lads, when there was a roll through from a defensive standpoint, switched to like an anaconda or a dart. I can never remember the difference. And he was sort of saying, well, why can't I do that? And I was like, you can do that. Like that, it's completely a valid technique. It just doesn't fall in line with what we're trying to improve. We're trying to increase the the skill within a guillotine and a front headlock context. Now, that doesn't mean in a real world situation that the DARS isn't a threat. It, of course, is a threat, and this is why we have to look at layering variability, because fundamentally, you're not always dealing with one problem. A good grappler won't give you one problem; they'll give you 6 to deal with. That's where technique linking comes in. That's where sequencing comes in, and all this various different stuff. But what we're trying to do, and again, this is where it gets more complex, because you're looking at who's in your class, what levels in your class, how much time do you have with the students that you teach. Like that changes how you implement these strategies. But from a constraint standpoint, what we're trying to do is influence a specific task. So in the context of what we were doing last night, or I was doing last night, it was guillotine front headlock. Now, is that person wrong because he switched to a DARS? Not at all. He's perfectly within his rights, but it just doesn't quite fall within the constraints of what we're trying to improve upon. This is where it gets challenging to do, and I've got on a massive tangent based on what your question was. Probably not even answered it, but but this is interesting, because this is where we can start to see how constraints fall in, because they have to be planned, they have to be layered, because otherwise we just end up doing specific sparring, and we might as well just be rolling, and we're not actually really influencing the time, for want of a better word, time under tension within a specific skill. Now, there is definitely time for open variability sparring.
Yeah.
And this is where we can start to see how the tasks that we set, or the objectives that we set, influence behavior. Now, to go back to the original point we made earlier about beginners versus advanced, beginners, you might use a more specific task. So in the context of last night, if I was looking at a beginner class, it might be very focused on the underpinning, can't get the word out, underpinning sort of theory behind a guillotine choke. Now, if I was working with an advanced class that maybe have more affordance from a front headlock perspective, I could open that variability to make it more relevant to them, because they are going to be grappling against better guys who are going to have a higher degree of variability and ability to switch. A beginner, if they lose the guillotine, they might not have any other options, which is fine, because they're a beginner, which is what we're trying to work upon. And we're trying to guide them towards that failure so that they can have a higher success rate at achieving a front headlock and securing the guillotine. So this is where it gets interesting. And the way I like to break it down from my perspective is I always like to look at things as like, this is not a technical term, this is simply the way that I've always realized it, is I look at it as open and closed variability, or open and closed constraint. So an example of this might be a closed constraint, might be something that's going to be much lower in variability and is much more specific from a task objective. So again, to use the example, this might be like you start in saddle and the attacker has to work to an inside finish, defender has to work the way out of it. Now, obviously, depending on who you're working with, you can break that down or you can open it up. Now, an open-based constraint, which is where there's going to be much higher levels of variability, might be we're going to wrestle from standing. You're going to work to an upper body control perspective. So that might be an underhook. It might be a 2-on-1. It might be a double body lock. And then you're going to work to a lower body takedown. So what we're trying to do is just change their interaction with the information that they're trying to work towards. Now, what I've not given any context of what those themes might be for the session, but the wrestling, it might be what we're actually trying to do is get them working on closing down distance and actually reducing the variability so that they can increase their chances of getting to a lower body takedown, as opposed to just closing their eyes and fucking going for it. There's time for. But it's interesting how that then influences how we look at the constraint, and where it does get complex. And again, this is why we probably will have to touch another episode on this in terms of like practice design, because it is quite a a complex topic, but what we want to try and think about is the broader the objective, the higher the variability. The higher the variability, the more problems they
Yeah.
have to solve. The more problems they have to solve, the less time within a given environment or within a given task that they get to solve. The less time they spend in the task, the less the reduced success and failure within that task, and the less understanding they have, and the less affordance they have from a skill standpoint, and less chance they have at solving the problem and improving the skill from that perspective, which again has got positives and negatives, and it's about using the right tool at the right time for the right group of individuals.
Yeah. Yeah, I think I like that point you make of either closing it off or opening it out, because you're either giving them more or less space to play within. So, like, to go back to the example of your guy with the dust or the mass or the anaconda or whichever one of them it was, he's, like you said, he's not wrong. He's just gone outside of the constraints for that day because you wanted them to practice the guillotine specifically so they can get more repetition without repetition of doing a guillotine. So it's almost like you said previously, it's kind of like drilling without drilling if it's quite a closed. To think of it in traditional terms, it's kind of like drilling without drilling. If it's a very closed game that they play, they get a lot of practice there. But it's still variable because the defender isn't just going, oh, okay, put my head there. Yeah, oh, lovely. Like, they're actually defending it and trying to deal with it all the way through to more open positional sparring or sparring from specific situations, which would be at the other end of the spectrum where it's much, much closer to like the absolute chaos of rolling. And then the fact, I think, to bring it back to the point that you made about that spectrum, is that competition sits on that far end of the spectrum and drilling sits on that far end of the spectrum. And actually what we're talking about is a range of things in between.
Yeah.
So that we might occasionally use drilling if it's appropriate. Exactly. That's up for people to decide whether they want to go to that far end of it. But that if you're taking someone to go to the far end of competing at a high level, then not having any kind of path from one side of the spectrum to the other is probably not the best way to, it's the old thing of drillers make killers. Like, for some people it does, and for others it does fuck all and they just lose.
Yeah,
especially at the top level.
Yeah, and not to start bashing drilling again, but it's funny how everyone says drillers make killers, but all the killers are the people who probably do fuck all drilling as well, ironically. But,
Craig Jones, again, the podcast he did with Lachlan Giles, where they talked about some of the stuff that Danaher would do with them. And Craig was known for being much more like Kit Dale, of like hopping around places to just go and spar, and whether that's positional or whether that's full sparring, rather than sitting in a we're going to do 30 arm bars now kind of situation.
Yeah, and I think to summarise the points more generally, a good way of looking at it from a constraint standpoint is what we're trying to do is manipulate degrees of freedom. So we're trying to manipulate, like, there's a technical term within sort of ecological literature which they call freezing. So what they'll do is they'll almost, for want of a better word, again, it still follows like a reductionist view. They'll freeze degrees of freedom to try and create a more stable solution. So an example of this is like within racket sports, they might look at the individual element of the pitch and the toss and hit the thing, as opposed to worrying about aiming too much. They'll use that to sort of break it down a little bit more. But obviously, they're not going so specific to the point where it's like you have to hit it this way. They're just manipulating the degrees of freedom so that individual can figure out a way that works really well for them. And this essentially is what we're trying to do from a constraint perspective. And to use again my example from last night is, I was manipulating how much freedom they have to interact with a task. Like you said, there was nothing wrong with switching to the DARS. Nothing whatsoever. If anything, it was the right thing to do in that situation. And I'm not going to give someone a bollocking for doing something that they perceived as the right thing to do. Yeah. It was just, it was my fault for not explaining the task enough. He just sort of hadn't understood the task that we're trying to do. And there's a lot that goes into this. We've talked about like managing intensity and all that sort of stuff. But again, it comes down to the people you've got in the room and how that buy-in you've got to interact with the task. If you've got somebody, if you go, right, guys, we're going to work from the back, and everyone's like, for fuck's sake, and it's just half-assed, you're just not going to get the same response, and that constraint is just, it's going to have no value because they're not getting representative reactions to the task that you're trying to deal with. So there is elements of this that you have to get buy-in. You have to have the right environment for the people to operate in the room. They're going to influence success. But what we're fundamentally trying to do is just, like I said, manipulate the degrees of freedom that somebody has to operate in. And there's a time and place. Again, if you look at that degree of freedom, again, as use the spectrum example, there's a time to like hyper constrain and try. And if somebody's really struggling with something, you can hyper constrain. Now, there are certain things within the ecological world where people are using certain things as what they call, the technical term is creating noise. And by creating noise, they're trying to disrupt sort of normal movement solutions. Now, there are some really no, sorry, go on, Dave.
So, my understanding of this is that you're essentially trying to push someone out of their preferred solution.
Yeah. Exactly.
So that they have to try and discover something else.
There are really good ways of doing this, and there are some utterly diabolical ways of doing this. I've seen videos of people passing hard with like aqua bags on the back. Like, what the fuck are you doing? Like, you've gone so far off the end there. Like, you've gone so... Oh, mate, I genuinely baffled me. Now...
So the point that I think we would make there is, and I think aqua bags, unfortunately, make a very big crossover into this whole thing, because the idea is that the water moves and it makes every movement more chaotic, and therefore the skill will develop in a different way. The reason that's not appropriate for jiu-jitsu is because aqua bags work, arguably, depends on who you listen to, but they work nicely if you have a very, very constrained skill as it is. For example, the run-up to delivering a fast bowl, or sprinting, or there you can create a degree of variability within the skill, because the skill itself, there's no opponent in terms of during that moment of the skill. So that just fucking beggars belief that someone thinks that it's monkey see, monkey do, isn't it? You go, they use it in that to constrain theirs. At what point in jiu-jitsu do you ever have an opponent on your back while you're passing someone else's guard? Like,
oh mate, it's fucking ridiculous.
What's it supposed to replicate?
Yeah, it's bollocks, mate. It's bollocks. Like, and there are certain things I can see the value in. Like, and I'm not saying that they're wrong, but I just can't quite get on board with them. Like, a big one is like the eyes closed. So people close their eyes.
Yeah.
The dog's causing chaos again. And I get it. I understand why they're using that as noise, because obviously by closing your eyes, it changes how you perceive information. You can't take in the information the same way. It changes the sense from a visual sense to a sense of feel, and that'll change your affordance to action. However, if you are fortunate enough to be born with relatively good eyesight and you've got two eyes in your head, my brain sort of says, well, I'm always going to use them. There's never going to be a point in a match where I go, oh, I'm down here, right, I'll just shut my eyes. And I get it. I just, it's one of the few things from this side of things I just can't quite get my head round. But,
So I suppose the counter argument there is, in my head, I would have said that's going to be more useful depending on how you're going to have to find the right individual, because for some people, you know that they have shit feel for it. They're not aware of when they're off balance. They're not aware of, like, their proprioception just isn't good enough. Visually, they can see it, and you might find that by arguably visually, but that constraint might be useful for someone that you know is constantly off balance, because then suddenly they have to pay attention to that signal because they haven't. I'd argue it's actually less noise. It is noise in the fact that you're throwing them off, but really you're trying to guide them towards a different signal and be like, oh, look, you can pay attention to physically how your body feels, rather than just, what can you see? Oh, there's an arm, I'll go for it.
Yeah.
You know, you can feel whether that person's trying to off balance you. But like you said, you don't want to create a room full of people who are purposefully closing their eyes
No,
and taking useful information away from themselves.
for sure. And I think that's again, it comes back to using tools and stuff like that, and what you are trying to do. And for those who maybe, I mean, if you're not disengaged already, thank you. But for those
people who've made it this far,
yeah, if you made it this far, for those who maybe are sort of misinterpreting what we're trying to say is, again, what you're trying to do is change somebody's interaction with the environment. So by using noise, whether it be a fucking aqua bag if you're a knobhead, or closing your eyes or something like that, then what you're trying to do is change how somebody is interacting with that task, again, through a...
Is that where people use like tennis balls and stuff?
Yeah, so tennis balls
so you might use it in a favoured hand, or...
Yeah, you can't grip, and you
force you to play off the other side.
Yeah, like various different things. And I think we're going to talk about this in a second, because obviously we're at an hour and a half, and I've probably got about 20 minutes.
Yeah.
But,
yeah.
This is probably where, again, this is where they lose people as well. And this is where we have to find that balance, because you're trying to convince people who are trying to... And there's always... The problem is with the ecological approach, or whether you're using this constraint-led approach, or just constraints in general, is we lose people with just bollocks, really. Like, we can't argue with science and then go, right, let's chuck an aqua bag on a 40-year-old bloke and that's going to help his guard passing. It's just not going to work.
Yeah.
And we have to find this balance of how can we argue for the benefit of effective practice, and using various different tools and strategies to build a more effective practice that's centered around individual development. But then we go, oh, put a bag of water on your back. Like, it's just like, you're not going to help the situation there. You're not winning the argument. You just look a knobhead. Nobody's buying into the system. And like the guys who I coach are relatively well bought into the system. They're intentful. They bring the intensity. They train hard. They, for the most part, follow the objectives that I tell them to follow. And the games that we play, they apply themselves really well. If I turned up and went, right, guys, here's some bags of water, they're going to go, what on earth are you going on about here? And there's no science in the world that is going to change that perspective. Like, it's not. We're straying too far away from the task of getting people really good at grappling. Like,
and I think as well, like, there's a real risk with that sort of approach of it all going a bit Mr. Miyagi, because we've talked about this before, that sometimes this is sort of posited as like the anti-cult, it's all about the development of the individual and putting them at the center of this process so that they can improve for themselves. And that's really important. But if you then start coming in with the constraints that are just fucking bullshit, then you're creating a different form of cult leadership around yourself without even necessarily intending to, because you're the person with here is the constraints that we are going to bring in, and you may not question my approach, and I know what's best for you. And that was the thing that we were trying to avoid in the first place. And all we've done is swap, drilling and talking about borderline fascism like it's cool, and fucking water bags and David Weck videos, because it's not like you have to still be open enough. You have to not lose your critical ability. Like, you have to have a certain common sense aspect of like, what is a useful constraint to use here and what isn't. It's like for you and me in strength and conditioning, we see people all the time taking movements from sports and trying to replicate them in the gym. And frankly, it's by and large a fucking waste of time, especially in jiu-jitsu. If you're in something that's very constrained as a sport, maybe there's an argument for it. Say you're throwing javelin, then yes, you can start to play with very specific movements and see if they carry over. But if you're trying to do that with jiu-jitsu, there's just so much going on and so much variability and so much motor learning happening already, that trying to take one specific portion of it and make that the key is just a waste of time. Because what if that situation never comes up? So like trying to create, well, like you said, the fucking water bag, or change how you pass. Well, why would you use that when you could just say pass off your like weak side? you're
That's
left-handed,
exactly
pass
what I
off your
was going to
right.
say. If you wanted to change, if you wanted to interfere with how somebody interacts, why could you not just use a simple task as, like you said, go to the other side? Like Eddie Gamel's, actually, to give him another shout out, he posted. I heard him speaking about on one of his podcasts. He used a really effective one where one of his guys was in the gi, and he kept using the same escape where he grabbed the gi, so he took the gi off him, which is a really effective constraint because it's now changed how he's done it. Now he's not gone, right, you're going to hold a dumbbell in one hand and you're going to skip on your right leg whilst you do it. Like, let's try and apply a bit of context. Remember, the idea with this is that it's more representative. The idea is that it has that representativeness. It has that challenge point. Getting a 40-year-old bloke to wear a bag on the back whilst they're passing guard is the least representative thing I've ever seen in my life. Yeah. And you can use whatever fallacy from a theoretical standpoint to make that up. But just because we don't understand the true underpinnings of how we apply this from a 100% guarantee standpoint doesn't mean you can just use bollocks and label it as effective. Like, it's wank. There's no money on earth that will convince me that putting water on somebody's back makes them a better guard passer. There's nothing. I don't care how much literature you produce.
But also, why move towards something as complex a constraint as that when you could use something as straightforward as use your gammy side?
Yeah.
Like
shit coaching.
It's also potentially it's buy-in because it looks sciencey. Like, you think of that, there's coaches who post it, and I'm like, do you really do that with your guys?
And then how far are we away from some fat cunt in a sports hall teaching karate? Do you know what I mean? Like, it's like, that's the point. And this is where we're losing people. And I want to make this very, very clear. The constraint is still within the realms of combat sports. We're still using a constraint that is representative of that combat sport.
Yeah.
We're just trying to influence how somebody interacts with the task of that combat sport. That's what we're trying to do. Wrestling is still wrestling. Guard passing is still guard passing. Now, there are certain tricks and techniques we can use that are going to, like you said, change how somebody interacts with that information that they're gaining, whether it be pass to the wrong side, whether it be instead of using this certain pass that they like to do, we're going to not allow them to use it. We're going to try and get them to do something else. But it's still representative of that task. The information that they're getting is still going to be based on an interaction with the task. Again, we had a conversation about intensity in the week. I'm not a believer that we have to monitor intensity, because the individuals will monitor intensity. Variability will monitor intensity. The drills that we put in place will monitor intensity. If I put somebody on their back, the intensity will be low until the person starts to escape and they've got to gain the back. The back. Then the intensity will come. Yeah. Guard passing. If I start somebody in chest to chest, there'll be low intensity until there's a fucking scramble. Then the intensity comes. But that's representative. You can't have intensity all the time. We can't look at intensity as... I'm going down the rabbit hole. I'm going to have to come back. Anyway, we'll be here all day. But that's what I mean. It's representative. We don't have to interfere too much because the individuals and the task will create that representativeness for us.
Yeah. But I think that's kind of an important point to start bringing it to a close with, is the reason you have to be so thoughtful about the way that you plan these constraints and what you're looking for and seeing if you're actually getting what you're looking for is, like we talked about on the previous episode, you can really fuck someone up by doing this wrong.
Yeah.
So you can create compensations that you don't actually want and problem-solving routes that aren't actually efficient or useful. So why give them something so complex when you can give them something simple? And to bring it back to where this conversation about intensity came from, I was having a discussion and I kind of mentioned it to one of my clients who's a brown belt, and he made a really nice point and I was a bit pissy about it because I thought he didn't understand me and I was being really clever. And actually the point that he made was really solid. Was jiu-jitsu's got a really bad habit of encouraging people who are intense in the way that they roll or aggressive in the way that they roll to rein it in And to a certain extent, that's necessary. There are situations where that's appropriate. You've got a smaller training partner and you're 120 kilos. Fucking rein it in. Don't throw them around. But you don't do that by actively discouraging that person from seeking that out. Because what happens is, he used himself as an example, was he'd kind of gone the whole like technique and relaxed and all of that route, and found it hard to put it together at competition, and found that only at brown belt had he started to chase that intensity again and actually really try and like lay the pressure on people and find a work rate that suited him rather than a work rate that people told him would make him better at jiu-jitsu. And I think that's the point, is that sometimes we've all seen that person who's got sublime jiu-jitsu until some big fucker from rugby league turns up and just goes, yeah, fuck you, I work harder than you. And suddenly the pressure and the relentlessness makes that person fall apart because they're not used to having to do it again and again and again and again. Oh my God, he's back up on his feet. It's happened again. And that is something worth bearing in mind, is that your constraints need to mean, like you said, they need to be representative. We need to make sure that the end result is still useful, and why competition can be such a helpful bit of feedback in the whole process, whether that's just sparring competition or whether that's actually going and competing, because you can see if you're creating like inadvertent responses. Yeah,
for sure.
But
that's sense. I mean, again, we'll summarize on this there quickly, but again, what you've just mentioned is a really interesting thing to think about from a training perspective. So if we're looking at this, let's say we are looking at it from a true ecological standpoint, in the idea that we have this executive variability and that no action is ever the same, then in theory, we don't want to dwell on intensity. We don't want to limit intensity, because that's variability. That's the exact idea of not repeating the solution, repeating the problem. So if, let's say, for example, we've got a class full of people, and let's say I say to you, Dave, right, Dave, I want you to go and work a knee cut. Okay, we're going to do 4 5-minute rounds, and every time you get swept, you'll reset and you'll go again. Dead basic. Now, it's a terrible example of a constraint, so please, people, don't copy that. I'm just using it to make the point. Every person you train with is going to provide a different problem. So you're getting that element of variability. So why would we constrain? Now, obviously, contextually speaking, if someone's being an oaf and it just isn't doing anything, then there is some intervention that needs to come. Safety. But in theory, that's that variability. Now, you're following the governing practice, you're following the theory, you're getting variability, you're not repeating the same action over and over again. You're having to problem solve, you're having to be flexible, you're having to be adaptive to the environment that you're in. You're getting a broad spectrum of information from a various different environments. You're going to not only learn new skill, but you're going to consolidate skill under various different constraints. So why would we limit that too much? Your one person's understanding of, right, everyone go 80% is going to be different from somebody else's interaction of 80%. So I think there's too much emphasis put on it, and it's almost, in a way, it's just a bit of a cop out from actually coaching an individual. If you've got, that's what coaching's about. If you've got someone who's going too hard and is kicking fuck out of all the 60-kilo girls in your class, you can't just go ecological. Like, you need to fucking intervene and be like, listen, pal, let's just knock it down 50% and try and work on the task. On the same hand, if you've got someone who's a limp dick in the corner, I love that analogy, then you might have to say, how can we have a conversation with them and go, how can we think about increasing your intensity a little bit more? How can we put a little bit more effort into it? Is it going to be that we use descriptive language to get them going a little bit more? Or is it going to be that we change the drill for them so that they have to push a little bit more? We might steer them towards a more intense round. Because that
you might. I was going to say training partners. Might just
partners
completely influence what you can and can't do.
To then put the bedrock of it on. It's not all about practice design. Constraints come in all shapes and sizes, and hopefully, if you've listened to this, that's the point that I want you to take away: is that we're all influenced by constraints, and that's how we can influence practice. Now, obviously, the
Yeah.
constraint-led approach is a very in-depth conversation in terms of, like I said, practice design and all this different stuff. But
Yeah.
if that's the message you can take away from today, is that we are influenced by constraints in every area of training. And it's about, again, how can we manipulate those degrees of freedom to get the response that we want to get out of an individual, and how can we then take that and apply the relevant tool to that individual in order for them to succeed at a skill based on the concepts that we've talked about, whether it's representativeness, whether it's a challenge point, whether it's the constraint that we're working in, whether it simply is the intent that we give them from an objective standpoint, because intent is going to influence our interaction with the task and the behavior. And that's the thing we want to think about from a coaching standpoint.
Perfect, mate. I think that's a really good way to wrap it up.
I do.
We'll
Agreed.
start with the Q&A next time.
Yeah, we will, because I've got work to do. We've been here for nearly 2 hours. But yeah, no, that was really good. Enjoyed it. Again,
nice one, mate. Right.
What we should say, quick, I've realised this now, because we are podcasters.
Yeah.
Okay. So we haven't set up a YouTube yet, but we probably should do that. We'll set up a YouTube. So that therefore means you need to like and subscribe where possible, please.
Very good.
That helps us promote this podcast.
And comment if you disagree.
Yeah, and comment. We'd love to hear your feedback. Obviously, again, in all seriousness, hopefully you enjoy it. Obviously, we really, really appreciate the people that are listening to this. And if you do have any ideas, you want to interact with us again, same as last episode, please either drop me or Dave a message on social media, or like I said, comment on the video, or obviously we're always using like Q&A boxes and stuff like that on social media. So feel free to drop a question in there as well. And we'll get back to you either whether it is on this. We are planning on doing a Q&A question. We've just got a bit carried away today. Or we'll obviously speak to you directly over message. But like, subscribe, and all that bullshit.
Very nice. Right.
Perfect.
See ya.
Right. Cheers, Dave. Take it easy, mate. Have a good day.